It's so amazing to see so many familiar faces in the crowd right now. You know, for a split second here, Boston kind of felt like home. You know, but it wasn't always this comfortable for me in Boston. When I first came here, I was in awe of the city's ability to balance nature with human life in a way that was aesthetic, well thought out, and for me, thought-provoking. So every morning I would wake up with the sun at 6 a.m. and I would walk for 3 hours before my first class along the Charles River via the Charles River Esplanade. But on these walks, I started to have moments of reflection and introspection. Although I was miles away, Georgia was on my mind because that's where I was from. And because Georgia was on my mind, I began to wonder, why was my life in Georgia so different? Why was nature never this accessible? Why was the option of walkability not even a thing, because our sidewalks were basically ornamentation for drivers to look at as they sped by? Why didn't I have access to public transportation just feet away from where I lived like I did here? Why? And in order to find answers to these questions, I had to do some research, historical research specifically. And so I started diving into the history of the state from which I come, Georgia. And Georgia was actually some of the first of the stolen land settled on by colonists and settlers. And as our nation developed, it was one of the first 13 colonies. But it was no regular colony, no. Georgia was actually coined the criminal colony. So if you committed a crime, you'd be sent down to Georgia to perform some physical labor in order to repay your debts to society. That means from the very beginning of Georgia's existence as, I guess, a pre-state, a colony, it has been a place that has existed on the basis of forced labor of bodies. And so Georgia continued to thrive off of forced labor as we went into the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War. They exported many things like peaches, pecans, but one thing in particular that kept them on top was the exportation of people, enslaved peoples, on the basis of race. And so slavery is a sticky situation after a while. The North was ready to get rid of it, but the South wanted it to continue. They wanted to preserve it, and in many ways expand it to the new states. And so tensions began to rise between these two geographic areas. And it wasn't long before the nation found itself knee-deep in a civil war. And this would continue, but by 1864, Atlanta, Georgia had been reached by Union troops, and just about everything in their way was burned to the ground. And by 1865, the entire South was forced to concede. And so now we had newly freed peoples, but Lincoln took it upon himself to further punish the South, and he did that by withholding much needed financial assistance to the South as we tried to rebuild in the Reconstruction period. Now that punished the South, absolutely, we felt that. But what it also did was put power back in the hands of the same people that just rose arms against you on the basis of trying to enslave people for their race just months and years prior. And so these same people were now in charge of rebuilding Georgia. They were in charge of creating the social fabric. They were in charge of legislation. And so we entered a period of mass white violence, often backed by legislation like Jim Crow laws. But we also began to see the development of ethnic enclaves in resistance to this mass white violence that Black peoples were now facing. These enclaves showed up in cities like Savannah, Georgia, in the city where I spent a lot of my time growing up, Atlanta, Georgia. And due to redlining, you won't really actually find Atlanta natives in all areas of Atlanta. I know people will try to tell you you're not really from Atlanta, but if you're historically from Atlanta as a Black family, you should be in the southwestern part of the city, largely due to racism, these ethnic enclaves forming, and then the fact that you were then redlined into your area. And so redlining is a process that basically labels a neighborhood as worse than the others, as we've now found out, basically based who lives there. So if there's a lot of Black people in an area, it's gonna be redlined, and your property values will be lower, which means your property taxes will be lower, which means the funding for your cities and projects inside them and funding for infrastructure and things you'll need, that will also be lower. And so historically, this continued, and today we have maps that look like this. I'm gonna walk you through each one of these. If you'll notice though, just looking, on each map, a similar area seems to be a different color than the rest of the map, the southwestern part of the city. So, the first map, we have some blue. The more blue it is, the higher the rates of poverty. The second map, we have red, orange, heat colors. This is heat indexing. The more close to red it is, the hotter that part of the city is. In the final map, we have orange and pink. The more pink an area is, the higher the Black population. So why is it that wherever Black people reside, it tends to be hotter? Well, as I said earlier, these places have less funding for things like building and infrastructure. So what we have in these communities is an overuse of cheap building materials, one of those being concrete, right? And so when the sun beams down on blacktop, temperatures tend to rise. But what we also have in these communities, I don't know if you noticed in the picture earlier, is a lack of trees. Trees provide coverage and shade for blacktop so that temperatures don't rise. Researchers from Spelman University found that despite not even being the central business district of the city, these areas where Black people reside, on average, tended to be 10 to 12 degrees hotter than their neighbors. We also see higher rates of poverty. Again, even the properties they own are said to have less value. But because there are higher rates of poverty, that actually feeds into something else. It is not really economically advantageous for things like grocery stores to be in these communities. So now we have a food desert. And what that means is it's hard to get fresh produce. Researchers at Emory found that Black neighborhoods in Atlanta, only 36% of them have fresh produce in their grocery stores. While white neighborhoods, 61% of their stores carry fresh produce. In a fresh food report, it was said that in 2015, only 52% of Atlanta residents had access to fresh produce within a half mile of them, most of those being in the northern and more affluent and white areas. But we started to see some improvement in 2021, where the same report said that by this year, 75% of people in Atlanta had access to fresh produce. But don't get happy too quickly, because I did some more research. And what I found was that actually in 2020, something historic happened for the city of Atlanta. For the first time in really Atlanta's history since having enslaved peoples and limited overseers, Atlanta had lost its Black majority. So then the changes I started to see in Atlanta started to make sense. You see, we started seeing the expansion of the Beltline, a walkable and bikeable path that connects the city, despite the fact that it displaces thousands of families in the historic West End of Atlanta, a historically Black neighborhood. We saw the expansion of MARTA, despite the fact that decades prior we had continued to try to vote on this expansion, but the white neighborhoods that surrounded the city said no because they didn't want Black people coming to their areas. We saw the introduction of Whole Foods and other stores that carry fresh produce as the demographics of neighborhoods in the city started to change. And I was forced to realize that city's abilities, my own city's ability to move forward, was based on the lack of permanence of my people in that city. The city we worked so hard to build, oftentimes against our will and without pay, was progressing as it successfully ridded itself of us. Environmental racism can be defined as disproportionately negative impact of environmental hazards on communities of color. And I wanted to see if this was just an Atlanta thing. Or I wanted to see if it was more than an Atlanta thing. I actually wanted to see if it was also happening here in Boston. And so I began to do some research. I wanted to see if Boston was accommodating Black people as it grew more sustainable. And what I wanted to measure was financial statuses of Black families in this city. And one way in particular to see that is by comparing net worths of Black and white families in Boston. And so I found a Boston Globe article comparing the net worth of Black and white families. Now, if you're not familiar with the term net worth, I'll break it down for you. Net worth is what you own. It's what's to your name. It's what you've paid off. So if you're driving a car and you still own payments on it, that's not in your net worth. That's actually a liability. So what you still owe is actually diminishing your net worth. It is until you have completely paid off something and it is in your name that it is added into that value. Now in Boston, the average net worth of a Black family is $8. Laughable, right? It's not even enough to buy a combo at your local fast food chain. But the net worth of white families was $247,000. To put that in perspective for you, I've added something we all might be familiar with, Harvard Stadium. It says that Harvard Stadium can fit about 30,000 people. So on a sold-out game day, each person in those seats represents just one time the net worth of a Black family in the city can fit into the net worth of a white family in this city. So while Boston may look diverse on paper because of all these institutions that bring people in from all around the world, it is not a place of permanence for Black people. You see, Black people have liabilities here. Boston benefits from our labor contributions and our financial expenditures, but it has not made itself a place for us to stay. And so I realized that river that I was by every day and all these sustainable efforts that I was engaging in here was largely because I did not exist here permanently. But it's not just here in Boston or there in Georgia, it's in all corners of our country where racism is ruining our environment. Whether you look at Flint, Michigan, that has been without fresh water for years due to inadequate infrastructure and environmental ruin. Whether you look at Cancer Alley in Louisiana, a strip made up primarily of Black neighborhoods and Black peoples that has the highest rates of cancer and cancer deaths in the world due to pollution from oil drilling off the coast of the state, making its way into their everyday consumable measures. Or in eastern North Carolina, where we have contract farmers literally spraying pig feces mixed with ammonia, yeast, and other chemicals on Black communities that surround them. Or even on Native reservations in the Midwest, where they're getting forceful pipe placements for oil drilling again. In all corners of our country, racism is ruining our environment. I believe in a future where your race, your zip code doesn't determine your access to fresh food, to clean water, to clean air. I believe that we can grow sustainably together, and that voices of color should be included in these conversations and in these cities and in these rooms and in these efforts. I stand in front of you as a source of education, but also to inspire you, to become curious about the world around you. Because oppression doesn't come from nowhere, and all forms of oppression build one on top of the other, creating a wall, an open-air prison that encompasses us all at some measure. So when you speak out against one, you speak out against another. And when you raise your voice, you gain support. But it's only when you become curious about the world around you and enraged about the wrongdoings of your brother or your sister that you can begin to do that. We have to educate ourselves. We have to empathize with one another and listen. Because in a period that's marked by book banning and the banning of talking about race in classrooms, these politicians aren't going to do it for us. It is time for us to have community and to collectivize and to listen to one another, so that slowly but surely we can begin to chip away at this wall of oppression that surrounds us until one day, together, we will all rejoice in a state of Jericho. Thank you so much for being here today.